Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Bookshelf, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. In this segment, we look at books pertinent to the contemporary study of South Asia. I am Ramita Iyer, research analyst at ISAS. Today, we will be discussing the book Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 1962, with its author, Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Ambassador Rao is a career diplomat who has served as India's foreign secretary, the senior-most position in foreign service, and the second woman to occupy this post. During her illustrious career, she has been India's ambassador to Sri Lanka, China, and the United States. She was also the first woman spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs. It is indeed our pleasure to have her with us today. Ambassador Rao will be in conversation with Professor C Raja Mohan, Director of ISAS. Professor Raja Mohan, please.
Thank you, Ramita. And let me join Ramita in welcoming Ambassador Nirupama Rao to the event at the Institute of South Asian Studies. I know for Ambassador Rao, South Asia is a special affection. I know she runs a South Asian symphony orchestra. So it's particularly of interest to us. And I think we need to have you a lot more with our programs because we deal with whole of South Asia. And you've always taken a larger perspective of the region. So we look forward to having you more. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Let me begin by congratulating you. I think your book, The Fractured Himalaya, has already gotten fantastic reviews all around. And many people, I think, praising it as really a must read and the classic text on the problems or the tragedy of Sino-Indian relationship, which has been a live news in the last few years, but very few have had sense of what is the problem and how did the problem begin when just after our independence. While there are a large amount of India-China expertise, I mean, it's really still very opaque in terms of the nature of the problem, how it happened. And then it's got so enmeshed in current politics always, that how we think about the past is trapped always in the current political discourse on China-Indian relationship. So I think you've done a great service by giving us this comprehensive account and a fairly, I would say, objective account of what actually happened. Before we get to the book itself, maybe you could tell us, I mean, you spent a lot of your career in the Foreign Office on China and in China. So maybe you could tell us some of your work on China.
Yes. Thank you so much, Raja. And I wanted to begin by saying that I first came to deal with China by a simple twist of fate, literally. It was way back in 1984. I had come back from a few months of leave spent in Harvard. And I was really looking for a placement in the MEA, a desk, because you have to normally wait a little once you're back to get a suitable spot. And it so happened that there was a vacant position of Deputy Secretary East Asia in the East Asia Division. And in those days, and I'm talking of 1984, 22 years after the conflict of 1962, 8 years before that, we had restored ambassadorial level relations with China. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had sent Mr. K.R. Narayanan as what Mr. Narayanan would always say as the normalization ambassador. So it was 8 years after that I came to deal with the subject, but still very much the East Asia division was a kind of a backwater. I mean, the kind of frenetic activity and focus that you see today, or even a few decades earlier on China, was completely absent. They told me they needed somebody to work on the India-China border because a lot of the people who had handled it in the erstwhile historical division had retired. And they were not around, people like Mr. G.N. Rao, T.S. Murthy. So they picked on me as a regular Foreign Service officer to begin a kind of a specialization on the subject. And that's how I was drawn into China. And for the next 8 years, I stayed at headquarters working on the desk, first as Deputy Secretary, then I became Director East Asia, and then finally it culminated in my becoming Joint Secretary East Asia. And so that was how it all began. And 8 years, I think, is quite a long span in which to immerse yourself in the study of the subject. And I was very fortunate, of course, to be there at that time. Sundarong Chu happened in 1986, and we had all the complications that ensued. And then Rajiv Gandhi went to China in 1988. So that's how I became a China hand, as it were. And I really enjoyed that stint, and I loved the work, I must say. I was drawn to the mountains, perhaps, drawn to the study of Tibet, drawn to the archival research. And then I went away and then dealt with China only when I became ambassador to the People's Republic in 2006. I went from Sri Lanka to China. And then as foreign secretary, of course, immediately after my stint in Beijing, I was foreign secretary, and that also involved dealing closely with China. So that is how my China experience unfolded as far as my career was concerned.
This book, I mean, it's not, most diplomats write memoirs, I mean, in terms of their experience and their work. But what you've done is something very different. I mean, it's not a memoir as much as actually an account of what actually happened. So there was a lot of research I could see from your citations, from the kind of documentation you look at. So it's quite a lot of rigorous research went into this book. So where all did you do the research for this book?
Yes, Raja, I started doing the research in 2014 when I got a Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship. That was, for 2 calendar years, really. And I also had a fellowship from Brown University. So that enabled me to do the research abroad. And the research in India, of course, the Nehru Fellowship helped me. So I began really with a lot of online sort of search for material while I was at Brown. Being at a university there allows you so much access to material which normally would be very difficult to retrieve or access. And then I went to the Foreign Office archives of the British government at Kew and accessed a lot of the records on India, which dealt with the subject of our relations with China. And there was an enormous fund of material, a treasure trove, literally. I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to look at the Hugh Richardson papers, to the SOAS in London for the Frank Moraes papers. And then I did extensive research at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, looking at the Nehru papers. As you know, Jawaharlal Nehru was our first foreign minister. And even though the records of the MEA on this period are essentially closed for all intents and purposes, at least on paper they are, there were a lot of telegrams and dispatches in the Nehru papers, which, normally the MEA would never have allowed access to, but they were there in the Nehru papers, and scholars were consulting it. I was not the first person to do it. And there were the private papers of P.N. Haksar, P.N. Kaul, Subimal Dutt, oral histories of people like K.C. Johari, for instance, or K.P.S. Menon. So I had more than enough material with which to work. And then I used my own experience as a practitioner to really focus and spotlight the material that I felt was relevant. I think being a practitioner helped me with that. And,
especially if you're on the desk, so where to look. Half the problem for a scholar is, look, you're inundated by the, even when you have lots of material. Yes. You then say, look, which was weighty, which was not, what was important, what was not. And so that's half the selection is as much the central element of research. And I think that really being on the desk, I presume, helped you a lot. This really, to all our young researchers, scholars who are watching this program, I mean, really, we used to think there was not enough material on India. India was completely closed. Indian foreign policy was a closed thing. But as Ambassador Rao just said, I mean, there is a lot available out there. I mean, in India itself, recently the MEA declassified some material, and then you have the American libraries, you have British libraries. So there is a lot of stuff available. So it's really, I think, finally, 75 years after independence, I think we're beginning to historicize our relationship, not to deal with it as a political discourse. That is, there's always a partisan political debate. But I think time has come to look back over the last 75 years. I mean, without judging the individuals right or wrong, but to see what actually happened, understand our past as a legacy. I think That's what comes through with this in this book so clearly. Nirupama, before we get into the main elements of the book, I mean, why did you write this book? I mean, what drove you into? I mean, must have been quite a labor to actually produce this.
But it was a labor of love, I would say, because when I went to Brown University in 2014, and I had to think about, contemplate a little on what I would do in that year and what I would write about. I began by thinking I would write a book about strategic communication. I had been spokesperson, and I knew a little about all this, this whole world of the media and how government has to relate to it. But then there was this other subject that, spoke to me a great deal, which was, my dealings with China, and particularly the studies that I had done of the early years of the relationship. And I was in a way compelled. I felt obliged, obligated in many ways, because of that experience that I'd had, to be able to provide some degree of enlightenment and education for a new generation of Indians about how this relationship had evolved. And I'm not saying that my word is the last word on it, but I felt I had a unique perspective, and which I felt would be a good thing to share with Indians who had not been around during the conflict of 1962 and were going to have to shoulder the responsibility of dealing with this relationship in the years to come. Even after our generation has left the scene, the China problem or the China relationship would still be a huge matter for India to deal with. So I felt I'd write a history, and that would be of great use, I hoped, for this young demographic.
I think you start in 49. I mean, I think one of the, my own, study of Indian foreign relations, I mean, we don't do enough exploration of the legacy. What did we inherit at independence in relation to our neighborhood, China, partition, and the West, and a range of issues. So why did you start at 49? I mean, you think in retrospect, I know the book was already long, but would you wanted to see what was the imperial legacy and the nationalist engagement between the Indian and the Chinese national movements?
Yes.
Was that, in a sense, important? But you didn't touch on that in the book.
Well, I did sort of, in a way, briefly, provide some detail about those years of the relationship, because I began my story with Jawaharlal Nehru's visit to China, his kind of aborted visit to China in September 1939, just on the eve of World War II. So I did make a reference to that and the kind of experience he'd had there, his radio talk to the Chinese people, his interactions with Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Soong, his wife. And so there are references to that. There was also a reference to Rabindranath Tagore's visit to China in 1924. I spoke about scholars like Professor P.C. Bagchi, who had written about India-China relations. So the first chapter of the book, which I call Freedom, Liberation, and Nationhood, refers to that period of the relationship. I spoke about the last nationalist ambassador, Ambassador Luo, in Delhi, who left, after the People's Republic was established in October 1949, a very, very disappointed and dejected man. He felt, he'd been cast away literally by the Indians. And so I wrote, and there is this fascinating account of a dinner he had hosted for Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Panikkar, and others, in which soon after independence, I think it was just about the time of independence, a week or so before independence, where the question of the national emblem was discussed. And Ambassador Luo claims in his archives that it was he who suggested to Jawaharlal Nehru and to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit that the Ashoka Chakra should replace, the spinning wheel that had been on the tricolor before that. And why it was essential, because it symbolized the the life and the times and the work of Emperor Ashoka, who had been such a prince of peace after, his bloody experience in Kalinga, and how he had united the whole country. It's a fascinating anecdote, maybe trivia. I don't know to what extent it's true, because in India, that story has never been carried by anybody. But the Chinese like to have, a say in all this, as you well know. So that's the nationalist component. But I did start with 1949 because, we are dealing with the People's Republic of China. That is the sovereign government of China today. So I thought I'd start with Nehru's recognition, the government's recognition of the People's Republic very soon after it was established, and the relationship that unfolded thereafter, which culminated in the conflict of 1962, all the ups and downs of that relationship.
It's a fascinating episode on Ashoka Chakra. I mean, I think there are a lot of episodes like that in the book, so it's really wonderful. I think it punctuates the complex narrative that you build in the book. Maybe you can help our viewers just to summarize the argument briefly of the book. I mean, so you say a lot about why you did it, but you also could tell us what is the argument, main argument in the book.
My main argument is that we have to understand history in order to deal with the present relationship. You have to comprehend the past in order to deal with the present and to plan for the future. That is essentially the argument of my book, and also that the lack of knowledge, this ignorance of what happened during those fateful years, would put us in a very difficult position in the future also, because there were lots of steps and missteps, calculations and miscalculations that led to the complex turn in events and the conflict of 1962. How did Nehru perceive the India-China border? How did he look at China? How did other members of his cabinet view this subject? When we negotiated the giving away of our rights and privileges in Tibet, why did we not take up the question of the boundaries simultaneously with the Chinese? Because when we talk of the McMahon Line today, we perhaps sometimes neglect to remember that this line was finalized in 1914 during the Simla Conference, and that the rights and privileges that we gave up in Tibet were also, in a sense, they stemmed from those Simla negotiations of 1914. We gave up the rights and privileges, but we thought that the Chinese accepted the boundary, and we didn't raise it in 1954. So lesson number one is guesswork is not good for diplomacy, that we should have read between the lines and taken up the matter. It may have been that the Chinese would have turned around and said, we are not ready to discuss this subject, but we would like to discuss it later. Even if that had been one of the conclusions of the 1954 talks on Tibet, at least India would have been better prepared to face the problem and to devise a strategy in order to deal with it. And the second point I want to make is, there's a whole industry that has grown up around blaming Jawaharlal Nehru for all that happened. I've tried to chronicle a narrative of the period which tells you the context in which India was at that time, a young nation consolidating its nationhood with a great deal of internal challenges, problems with Pakistan, and the impression that Nehru had in his mind that friendship with China would help India, in a sense, would give it some peace, would help also project an image to the Western world, particularly of this new third force in world politics, where India and China could be seen as a voice for this new world that had emerged with decolonization. So this was the second point that came out of this study. The third point was that public opinion, how do you manage public opinion in a democracy? And when the Aksai-Chin Highway was built by China, and we as a democracy had to divulge this news to Parliament, as we have always done. If you remember with Sundarong Chu, we made a statement in Parliament before it was really released to the public. And once that was done, and Nehru concomitantly took the decision soon after, in fact, a couple of years after he had decided to show our boundaries as defined and set and not to be disturbed, the decision he had taken after 1954. Soon after that, he takes the decision to release the white papers on all the correspondence that we had with China on this subject. So in a sense, I feel public opinion was fed a lot of information. I'm not saying it was false information at all. They were fed the facts on the dispute without any kind of counseling or guidance or, as you teach, you're a professor, it's not just enough to provide the material to the students. I mean, they can draw their conclusions from it, but you must be able to provide your perspective. That perspective was never provided. On the other hand, the opposition went up in arms and they were gunning for Nehru. A lot of people didn't want this friendship with China. And subconsciously, Nehru also realized deep down in his mind that China could create problems for India. And that was why on the boundary, he was always very, very, careful, tried to be extremely cautious about defending those frontiers, about the need to defend those frontiers. So this was the complex mix that emerged from that study. And my idea was that people should understand that there are so many contrasting hues in this story. There is no one black and one white.
That's why, in fact, you call Nehru a flawed hero. I mean, I think quite clearly he's the central figure of the tragedy, if you will, of on our side at least, of the Sino-Indian relationship.
That's right.
And that, while, Nehru is the object of current politics, never ceased to be one, particularly when we think about China. But you try to provide the context, in which the kind of expectations he had of China, the kind of context of the post-colonial, you talk about the thrilling post-colonial moment when there was the idea that Asia was going to come together. One thing that strikes out is, while in India we talk about Nehru and his enthusiasm for China, about Asian unity, the Chinese never have a positive word for Nehru. That for all that they like Rajiv Gandhi because they tried to normalize the relationship. But Nehru was always seen as the successor to the imperial India. So how do you explain this paradox? We think Nehru made mistakes by going too close, but they didn't seem to think much of Nehru's attempted embrace of them.
I think the views of Nehru were at the beginning of the period I write about. The Chinese were still making up their minds about Nehru, and they were prepared to deal with him, and he was useful to them. It was a kind of opportunistic view, but one didn't hear too much criticism. Even in whatever records that we have at our, at hand today. It was I believe, after the events of 1959, after the flight of the Dalai Lama to India, the revolt in Tibet, and the feeling at the higher echelons of the Chinese leadership, including Mao himself, that India was somehow dabbling in troubled waters in Tibet, that India had these imperialist urges. And Nehru, of course, was seen as, heading this kind of conspiracy against the Chinese interests in Tibet. And I think it begins with that. And then, of course, in the period before the war, when you see Premier Chou En-lai comes to Delhi in April 1960. And if you take an objective account, I do believe the Chinese did make a genuine attempt in April 1960 to try and see if some kind of understanding could be reached, some kind of mutual accommodation could be arrived at. And in a sense, Chou En-lai went away from Delhi. He left for Kathmandu and then returned to Beijing. He went away, I think, feeling rather spurned, if I may say, because he'd met a lot of the cabinet members and he met Nehru, had long discussions with him. And it was such a fallow field. It was completely a futile, aborted initiative. And I think that also embittered the Chinese a great deal about Nehru. And then you had the war, the conflict. And I think then, of course, it was very, very bitter. The springs of the relationship had become poisoned, as it were. And that I think is what happened. But although I do write in my book, quoting Ambassador A.K. Damodaran, that on 27th May 1964, after Nehru had died, the Indian embassy had opened a condolence book in Beijing. And for 2 or 3 days, nobody came. And on the third day, they got a message from the Chinese Foreign Office that an important visitor would be coming to sign the book. They didn't mention who. And a few hours later, Premier Zhou Enlai came himself with 2 of his aides and wrote in the condolence book, and spent some time with the officers of the embassy reminiscing about his time with Nehru. Yeah. And he spoke, with some degree of respect and nostalgia about those times. So who knows what the Chinese really feel in their minds. Yeah. But then his talks with Kissinger and Nixon later from 72 onwards, and you see the US records, there's a lot of, blame,
condescension,
and condescension, and rather, I mean, he talked about Nehru in very, very negative terms, which I think really Nehru did not deserve, I feel.
One of the things in your book is really, you mentioned the conflict, and Tibet was quite a central element. You talk about that in the book. Many of us who think about India-China relationship, I mean, we think Tibet as a card, or as Tibet as an issue, but you really humanize the whole Tibet question in the book. So that's really that really the people have paid a huge price for the way India and China have handled their relationship.
Yes,
have been the Tibetans. So you want to say something on that briefly?
Yes, briefly, I'll say something about that. I think the first, tragedy for Tibet that happened for the Tibetan people was that once the Chinese PLA moved into Tibet, Tibet came fully under the control of China, an old way of life for Tibet had gone forever, and a new order literally had replaced that. So you have a young Dalai Lama who's about 15 years old, fleeing Lhasa and coming to the Chumbi Valley and waiting in Yadung for some signal from India that, he could cross over into India, that he would be given some refuge, given this huge uncertainty that had enveloped Tibet. And he stays there. There is no word from India. He waits there and nothing happens. And then the 17-point agreement was concluded in May 1951, following which he really had no option but to accept those terms and, return to Lhasa. So that is one of the very poignant elements in the story that I write. Yeah. Simultaneously, Tibet taking the issue to the United Nations, and no country really except El Salvador, supporting it. So that is another sad account that it's true that India could have done nothing about the Chinese entry into Tibet. Now, for all those who say, Nehru gave up Tibet, Tibet was not ours to give up. I think we shouldn't delude ourselves about these matters. General Cariappa told Prime Minister Nehru that India could at the most spare 1 battalion to perhaps safeguard, the trade agency in Yatung. And even that, of course, would have been completely inadequate and wouldn't have served any purpose. So there were certain realities that we had to come to terms with. Even somebody like G.S. Bajpai, Girija Shankar Bajpai, although, he felt we should have a much stronger, hard-nosed policy towards China, he also understood as a realist that there was nothing we could do to withstand or to oppose the Chinese entry into Tibet. So I think this is one of those tragedies about Tibet. And then, of course, the Dalai Lama coming to India in 1956 for the 2500th anniversary of the birth of the Buddha. And there again, the revolt in Tibet had begun. He was very uncomfortable about going back to Lhasa, but Nehru persuaded him to go, and Zhou Enlai, of course,
himself came to take him back.
And he went back. He came to take him back, literally. Yes. So that's another sad chapter. But Nehru had begun by that time to understand, the nature of the Chinese strategy when it came to Tibet and the border, because differences had erupted. So his disillusionment had set in. And then, of course, 1959, one of the good things that India did was to offer refuge. Very, very spontaneously. There was no debate about it. We just felt we should. It was a human issue. It was a humanitarian need that should be met. And yes, and that has helped perhaps at least provide some space to the Tibetan people to keep alive their religious and cultural identity here in India. So that has been India's service, I think, to the Tibetan people.
One of the things you talk about the book, I mean, was really the triangular relationship with the US, or more broadly the West, because China was isolated after the Communist Revolution. Nehru was the only one, saying we got to engage them in a way that, if you look at this triangular dynamic, I mean, did Nehru, I mean, in retrospect, I mean, without judging on him personally, that there was a collective ideology in India at the time, whatever the source of it was, because of the national movement of Asian unity, Asian solidarity. Yet the sense that Nehru and India as a collectively underestimated Chinese ambitions and Chinese ambitions for power and the sense of territorial nationalism, while at the same time actually overestimating the troubles with the United States. I mean, in a sense, some of it during Nehru's kind of deliberate, distancing from the US, the kind of prejudgment of the US, while he was ready to expect a lot, or prejudge positively about China, he's prejudging negatively about the United States. That, in a sense, cut out a lot of our options as well, I think.
I think so. And, studying the British records, and while I was doing this, the thought can't help cross your mind. It crosses your mind that a lot of our views about the United States were conditioned by our British experience. There is a sort of patronizing attitude that I've seen among many, and not all, many Europeans and also, I think, British people about Americans in general. I'm talking of the older generation. That's not the case today because, the fact and the reality of American power dominates everything. But I'm talking of people who had grown up in the early 20th century, somebody like Nehru, who had gone to school and college in the UK. There was very little exposure to the United States. Unlike for China, everything that the Chinese did in terms of their exposure to the West before 1949, particularly, was conditioned by the American experience. Look at, if you go to Peita or Tsinghua today, universities in Beijing, they look so much like American campuses because, they were essentially founded before what they call liberation. And they have such a feel that is American.
The American missionaries.
Exactly. Our culture, our conditioning was so anglicized and so completely, defined by that colonial experience. We had very, very little exposure to the US. Somebody like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who studied in Columbia, who had been in the US, he had a very different view. He had a very different view of relations with the United States. So I think all that personal experience and that, that intellectual exposure greatly matters when it comes to the attitudes that you build up about the United States. It's very different today for many of us, but I'm talking of Nehru's generation.
Did we make the same mistakes we made in the 50s and 60s, in the 90s, when we had just restored the relationship and the Cold War had ended? And we framed our policy in terms of promoting a multipolar world. And the assumption, despite our differences with China on the bilateral level, they can be our partners at the global level. In many ways, very similar to what Nehru thought. And you, from then on, you were, in charge of policy for quite a while. You think in retrospect that we could have thought about the Chinese in a better way, or do you think, not judging on the people there, but it was quite clearly the same pattern of believing the Chinese can be our partners while suspecting the Americans of the worst?
Okay, well, if you look at the period of 1988 and onwards, and then you had the end of the Cold War, you had our own launch of our own economic reform and liberalization modernization process. All these things kind of telescope into each other. If you remember Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's own approach to the United States, I mean, that opening up had begun even in his time, and he had established some degree of personal chemistry also with the US presidents of the time. I think the steps that were taken on China, and I'm not saying it just because, you know, I was also part of the process that opened up, you know, the relationship. I think the steps that were taken, first of all, diffused a lot of the tension that we were facing on Sundarong too. Things were really going to the brink. You know, one studies what happened in those days. The degree of confrontation, the rise in tension were all palpable, and a step needed to be taken, steps needed to be taken, some bold policy initiatives needed to be taken to reach out to the Chinese and to that leap of faith that Rajiv Gandhi kind of made by going to Beijing, meeting Deng Xiaoping, and kind of both sides creating some degree of an architecture for the relationship, that we would discuss the boundary question, but we need not make that an obstacle to the improvement of relations in other areas. So I think it was a realist and a pragmatic approach to China. I wouldn't say that we were talking about bhai or friendship of 1,000 years, or, you know, the friendship of 2 billion. We never said those things. The Chinese may have talked about the peace 5 principles, and we were, I think, much more cautious about it. We understood also that the China-Pakistan relationship was constantly needling, you know, pricking us from time to time. I don't think we had many illusions about China, even at that time, but we had managed through that political diplomatic initiative to kind of reduce the tensions. And the opening and the segue to the Soviet Union really began with 1971. We virtually perhaps had an alliance with them by any other name, I would say. But the China opening and the opening to the US, which came really from the early 90s onwards, you were beginning to see it. But of course, the Pokhran tests sort of were some kind of regression. But I think I wouldn't say that we made the same mistakes as we made in the 50s. I think we went into it with very few illusions, I would say, but we had created a certain management regime, as I would call it, for the relationship with China, which collapsed last year in Galwan, of course.
So that brings me to the question. I mean, your book is in a way, timed, in a tragic sense, just when the relationship is unraveling in front of our eyes after 30 years of careful, deliberate construction of a management regime that you called it. So in retrospect, and now looking ahead, what do you see the prospects? Do you really think India-China really capable at this point, or that we are doomed at this point to go through a difficult phase before really any positive improvements can take place?
Well, I think we're really in quite a twilight zone as far as this relationship is concerned. There seems to be very little light being thrown on how the future of this relationship is going to evolve. The Chinese themselves have, today they look and act very differently from what they did at the time we are talking of, or even early 90s, and when we tried to normalize relations with them. It's a very coercive, muscular, assertive face of China that you see today. And after what happened in Galwan, our relationship with countries like the United States and Japan has become so much more important and crucial for us, and rightly so. And you see the flowering, as it were, of the Quad, and it's branching out into various areas of activity. And the whole polarization that you see today in the Indo-Pacific is in many ways attributable to this new face of China that we're all seeing, that, the threat perceptions that many countries today see and visualize from the Chinese. That includes India, with our long land border with China, almost 4,000 kilometers long. And also our sea and maritime interests, where obviously this clash of ambitions and this competitive coexistence is going to be the norm, really.
One last question, Nirupama. I mean, which is really, what is your next project? Are you planning another book? And after
Yeah.
this, can you
Well,
tell us a little bit on that? Yeah.
a lot of people have been saying, write a sequel to this and bring it up to date, especially since, I dealt with the relationship, and that would be my own lived experience. The period I wrote about was not my lived experience, but this one would be. So I'm contemplating that. Let me see. Right now I'm taking a little break on all these events surrounding the book. So I haven't completely made up my mind. The other option was to write something on Sri Lanka, but this China sequel, a lot of people have been advising me, or friends have been telling me that I should at least attempt to write something. Let's see.
Wonderful. I think we've taken a lot of your time. I mean, it's been wonderful having you, Ambassador Rao, with us. And to all our viewers, this book is a must-read because it throws so much light on what went wrong between India and China and the context and the conditions under which this tragedy unfolded. And we look forward to your book, to your next book, the sequel to this book. And I also hope you'll write a prequel, as they say, of the pre-49 engagements between India and China as well. So, Ambassador Rao, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us in this bookshelf program of the Institute of South Asian Studies.
Thank you so much, Raja. It was a pleasure to be on the program and a privilege. Thank you so much, and all the best.